Thank you for having me today. My name is Christopher Riddle, as mentioned. I'm Associate Professor and Chair of Philosophy at Utica College, where I'm also the Director of the Applied Ethics Institute. I've written 2 books on disability justice and human rights issues. I'm the editor of a 3rd, and at the moment I'm penning my 4th on this very topic, assisted dying and disability rights. My written testimony includes a peer-reviewed article that I'm basically summarizing far too briefly today for you, should you be interested in reading more about it. It's published in one of the leading journals in the world on this matter, and I'll intentionally keep my testimony brief so you can ask questions, and if you are interested, you have everything that I would want to say to you, probably written in a much better way than I can say it to you today. So thank you. In short, I'm here today to support medical aid in dying, and I am here to do so as an ethicist, as a disability studies scholar, and maybe most importantly, as a disability rights advocate. My goal is to convince you of at least 2 things today. First, that the opposition that emerges to this bill from disability rights-related groups that stand against it ultimately rely upon the claim that if we permit aid in dying, we run the risk of introducing risk and a potential for harm into the lives of people with disabilities. I suggest that this point ought not to be regarded as adequate justification to deny autonomy rights to New York State citizens. Second, I suggest that if we do in fact deny access to aid in dying, for this reason, we actually risk demeaning and infantilizing people with disabilities. In other words, if we want to promote dignity and respect for people with disabilities, I suggest that it's of utmost importance that we do not allow opposition to assisted dying to deny basic autonomy rights at the end of life. But let me return to my first point first. This is a point I take to be one about logic of the argument, and my second point to be one about the morality or justice of the argument. I don't think we actually have reason to believe that people with disabilities will be killed or seek to kill themselves in a misbegotten effort to save themselves from a life that ableist social attitudes deem to be not worth living. It's clear as evidence from other jurisdictions that have legalized aid in dying before New York State that there isn't an actual threat against people with disabilities. I say this because, as previously testified, approximately 80% of patients seeking medical aid in dying in other jurisdictions have had terminal cancer. In short, I don't think we have any reason to believe that with regard to aid in dying, people with disabilities represent a particularly vulnerable group that we need to protect. However, of course, it would be foolish to deny that there is a potential for abuse or harm. That said, this is part of the argument engaging with the logic of it, we do, of course, routinely engage in activities that have a potential for harm to emerge in them. I think most of us drove here today, and driving a car leads to a greater potential for harm than a lot of other modes of transportation. In fact, it leads to a greater potential for harm than a lot of other things in general. It's the 9th leading cause of death in the world. Approximately 40,000 people are killed on US roads a year. That's over 100 a day. Yet nonetheless, we opt to drive despite the risk because we perceive to be a benefit associated with driving that far outweighs that risk. And I say this to you because if one is in a car accident and one suffers harm, or if one's family member suffers harm, one does not conclude that we should abandon cars. Similarly, simply because assisted dying has at least a theoretical potential for harm, does not seem to me to suggest that we ought to abandon this legislation altogether. Pointing to particular cases where harm is done and suggesting that this is grounds to prohibit assisted dying altogether is like pointing to a motor vehicle accident as evidence to suggest the cars ought to be abandoned altogether. I simply don't think that it is a logical practice. Don't get me wrong, however, there's of course tremendous value associated with the stories and words of caution being told to you. Nonetheless, I take these anecdotes are powerful words of caution and things that we should take into account, as I'm sure you have, when crafting this bill. None of the concerns that are raised rise to overriding grounds that should cause an outright prohibition of this bill or this act. Merely, they should be words of caution that are taken into account and utilized carefully when we're implementing this policy. Now to my second point, the one about morality or justice. I suggest that compassion for suffering and respect for autonomy provide powerful pro tanto reasons for legalizing assisted aid in dying. And I also think that disability groups who oppose aid in dying do so because of what I view to be a paternalistic overemphasis on the vulnerability of people with disabilities, and that this view ignores the fact that people with disabilities are individuals who are capable of making decisions regarding their own life and their own care. Denying people with disabilities the right to exercise autonomy over their own life and death, in fact, says powerfully damaging things about the disabled, their abilities, and their needs to be protected. If we endorse this view, I think we confine people with disabilities to the roles established by disability discrimination. People with disabilities are not incompetent, easily coerced, or inclined to end their lives. But denying them the right to seek assistance in dying, we risk subjugating people with disabilities to these negative, stereotypical attitudes that permeate our society. I remain convinced, in summary, that opposing views advanced by disability rights activists rely upon, first, an illogical view regarding harm and aid in dying, and second, ultimately result in the perpetuation of injustice and immoral attitudes towards people with disabilities. In short, I think all individuals capable of offering reasoned and informed consent, including people with disabilities that fall within this category, should be granted the right to seek assistance in dying for not only, but principally, at least the two reasons that I advanced to you today. As promised, I hope I kept it intentionally brief, and I welcome questions or concerns. Thank you.
I have a question.
Thank you. Yes.
So,
Assemblymember Gunther.
my question is regarding, most people with disabilities certainly can make that decision themselves.
Sure.
Certainly they sign papers when they go into a hospital and sign the papers to be discharged from the hospital. So, disabilities doesn't mean that they don't have the ability to make life decisions. So, that's first and foremost. So my thing is an extension. It's about people that are suffering from mental health, people that hear voices, that their mental pain is just as bad as physical pain.
Sure.
And I'm wondering, where does this end, kind of? So how can we judge? I know that we just saw somebody pass away, a very famous woman, and at that point in time, she decided to have compassionate care, which, to reveal my past, my husband and my father died of pancreatic cancer, which, of course, they titrated in the hospital. The amount of medication so that you could see the grimace on his face, so you could see whether he was resting. So I think we're doing something similar to have people, and the Joint Commission that regulates hospitals all over the country right now, they mandate that patients in a hospital should never be in pain, that we should administer drug to make them, the smiley faces that they used to show, so that you were supposed to be pain-free. So I don't know where the beginning of it is or the end of it is, and I do understand the gentleman about Huntington's and his daughter making that decision, but sometimes I'm fearful, because having gone through 3 people that I loved and sitting by the bedside, I'm also a nurse, and I made sure that they died with both dignity and also without pain, and it was available to me. And I'm just wondering where mental health goes with this, and how much more should we be doing?
Sure. So first, I'm sorry for your losses. And second, what I'm not here to do is to suggest that the bill ought to be amended in any fashion. That's not my expertise. That's your guys' expertise. I'm here to support it. When I speak about people with disabilities and harmful attitudes being perpetuated, what I am doing is I'm suggesting that opposition to this bill, suggesting that everyone who's disabled opposes it, is simply wrong. I support people with disabilities. I've dedicated my life to this, and this is something that I absolutely support. Where the line is drawn, I think you guys have drawn the line with the legislation. It's different than that in Luxembourg that suggests that physical or mental suffering can be the case. You raise an interesting point about where that continuum, where we cross the threshold on the continuum, and to be honest with you, I have no idea where that